Joshua chapter 9, the story of the establishing of a peace treaty with the Gibeonites. Initially, this story would seem to be an ideal as far as Israelite approach. For as we know in Jewish tradition, the concept of peace is of great value. And here we have a foreign nation coming and actually initiating a peace treaty with the Israelites. So it would seem to be an idyllic story. However, what makes this story particularly fascinating is that it is quite equivocal. In other words, the position taken by the narrator isn't so certain. Is this something positive or negative? Are the Gibeonites to be viewed positively or perhaps critically? Unlike the rest of the book of Joshua, which is quite clear-cut, there is the Israelites who are coming and destroying the wicked nations of Canaan. Here we meet a more ambiguous position in relation to the Gibeonites. In classic diachronic modern analysis, this chapter is actually separated and divided into two parts. The first 15 verses, and from verse 16 and onwards till the end. And it's usually approached as an etiological narrative, namely that this is a narrative that's meant to explain a certain reality found in the time of the author. And the suggestion given is that the first part of the story, 15 verses, comes to explain the actual reality of foreigners dwelling amongst the Israelites, specifically these Gibeonites. And the second part of the narrative comes to explain their servitude, their a low position, societal position amongst the Israelites. I personally don't see much validity in this approach, and I actually see a quite united narrative. What we will find is that there's an interesting divide in relation to who is depicted as the leadership within Israel. And that has led to certain speculative theories that perhaps there are two strands here, a pre-monarchic, more democratic approach, and a monarchic approach, which is basically seen in the depiction of Joshua as a solitary leader. Once again, here, I don't think that is the explanation for what we find in the story, which is indeed different aspects representing the leadership of Israel. And we'll try to explain what is behind those different depictions as we move along. But I do think that the story can indeed be viewed as, in general, a particularly holistic, unified story. Let us begin with the opening verses of the chapter, which serve not only as the opening to our story, chapter 9, but I would say are actually structurally very important for the whole book of Joshua, and serve as an introduction to, I'd say, this second stage in the conquest of the land of Canaan. So we read in the beginning of chapter 9, "And it was when all the kings that were on this side of the Jordan, in the hill country and in the valley," I prefer translation of the foothills, "and on all of the shore of the great sea opposite Lebanon, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite heard of this, that they gathered together to war with Joshua and with Israel with a single accord," namely united. So we read here that all these nations heard something which is not elaborated, and we'll soon have to understand what they heard, but this led them to basically unite in a coalition to fight Joshua. Now, this opening kind of echoes a previous opening which we found in the book of Joshua earlier on in chapter 5. Let's just go back and see the opening of chapter 5. There, we also hear that the nations heard something. And it came to pass when all the kings of the Amorites who were on the side of the Jordan westward, and all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea, heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan from before the children of Israel until they had passed over, that their heart melted, nor was there spirit in them anymore because of the children of Israel. So here too, we find the nations hearing something. Here it's elaborated. What did they hear? That the Israelites crossed Jordan, and we have the response. What was the response? Basically paralysis, right? Their heart melted, and there was no spirit in them anymore, right, to meet up and face the Israelites. So the obvious question that we have to ask here is, what brings about the change? We have a dramatic change from paralysis to proactive unity in facing off against the Israelites. And it's not really elaborated what brought about this change. All we see is that they heard. What did they hear? Well, I think the easiest and most probable answer to this is that they heard exactly what was recounted in the previous chapter. And what was recounted in the previous chapter? We have the story of how the Israelites faced against the eye, right? And they required a second attempt to conquer it. In the first attempt, they actually failed. And here, if we ask, so what brought about this sudden change in attitude and approach of the Canaanite nations? Well, the answer, I think, would be simple. What did they hear? They heard of the Israelite loss to the Ai, remembering that the Ai was a small town, and nevertheless, the Israelites lost in their first attempt to conquer the Ai. And this brings about a dramatic change in their morale. Suddenly they see, oh, there's a possibility of overcoming the Israelites. We have a chance, and therefore they shift from their paralysis to their proactive approach in uniting against the Israelites. Okay, so we read about the rest of the nations. Like I said, this is an opening for the second stage of the conquest of the land of Canaan. And basically, I'd say that these two verses in the beginning of chapter 9 serve, like I said, as the opening of the second part from chapter 9 till chapter 12. And then we move on to the specific opening to our narrative. And the inhabitants of Gevon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and to Ai, and they also acted with wile, in other words, with cunning. And soon we'll read what they did. But first, let us inspect this comparison. We have a description of all the nations basically uniting to go to war. And then we have, and the inhabitants of Gevon also react, right? But they will do something totally different. They will not unite to go to war against the Israelites. Rather, they will vie for a peace treaty with the Israelites. And hence, not surprisingly, some English translations have translated the opening of verse 3, that one letter, Vav, Veyoshve Givon, not as and the inhabitants of Givon, but rather but the inhabitants of Givon, because there's an obvious contrast in what they're doing. They're not going to war, rather, they are trying to accomplish peace. However, I actually do identify with our translation here, which we found on the screen. The word and, I think, is correct here. And therefore, we have to ask why the and? In other words, if they're so different in response, why is it saying and the inhabitants of Givon are doing this? And I think the answer is that the narrator here wants to tell us that the Gibeonite initiative, while maybe totally different in its action, in other words, trying to get to peace, not going to war, actually has a similar ultimate goal. In other words, this attempt to gain peace is not out of goodwill and an appreciation of the Israelites, but rather is out of fear, right? And this fear, of course, is a direct consequence of what's elaborated that they heard, because they also heard, just like the rest of the nations. But here we have an elaboration. What did the Gibeonites hear? What Joshua had done to Jericho and to Ai, namely, obviously, comparing Jericho to Ai, that Joshua totally destroyed and annihilated these two cities. And hence, this, of course, arouses within them tremendous trepidation, right? And therefore, they decide to act. This act is an attempt to accomplish peace, but it may be viewed as a, if you will, a peace treaty, which is actually going to be used as a weapon against the Israelites. And this is a fascinating concept. Peace can sometimes be used as an offensive weapon. In other words, speaking peace and accomplishing peace sometimes could be aimed at harming the people that you're trying to make peace with. And hence, maybe that combination and the inhabitants of Gibeon, they decided on a different offensive approach, not to attack the Israelites on the war field, but, if you will, to attack them on the peace table, right? And use peace against them. Peace can also sometimes be something with motivated by negative, right, intention, motivated by fear, right, an attempt to harm your enemy through the weapon. It's a very unique weapon, a weapon of peace. So that may be what is hinted here, the comparison between the other nations and Givon, not necessarily a contrast, but rather a parallel of different approaches how to overcome the Israelites. So let's speak about Givon. Who is Givon? What do we know about Givon? So we know Givon has been identified with relative certainty. It's a town. It exists today. It's identified as what is today known as the Arab town of El Jib. You can hear the sound, Jib, Givon, right? It's close to modern day Givon, the Israeli town. It's located northwest of Jerusalem. In the ancient times, Jerusalem was a lot smaller, right? So it was like about 10 kilometers northwest of Jerusalem. Now it's pretty close to Jerusalem because Jerusalem has expanded dramatically to the north. And it was identified and even dug up in archaeological digs. They discovered impressive walls, right, that were very wide, right? And they also discovered an aqueduct which led the waters from a spring into the city, similar to what we found in other places like in Jerusalem and in Megiddo. And most famously, they also found what is called the Pool of Gevon, which is very fascinating and impressive. I was there a long time ago. Archaeological find. It's basically a deep hole which was constructed going down to the water levels. The subterranean water levels, it's like 25 meters deep, has a staircase built on this in a circular way, an elliptical way, going down in this hole to the bottom, to the pool, to the source of the water. It's famous. It was also mentioned in other stories in the Bible, particularly in the beginning of second book of Samuel, where the two army chiefs, Yoav, son of Tzruya, Joab, and Avner ben Ner, who was the chief of Saul, and his following king Ishbosheth, his son. They meet off there next to the pool in Givon, and they have a bloody duel. So this pool, fascinatingly enough, was dug up. It was excavated. The whole place was excavated in the 50s and beginning of the 60s by a team of archaeologists from the University of Pennsylvania, Pritchard, well-known archaeologist, led it. The pool itself was unearthed in 1957. Here I can share with you some pictures of the pool itself. Let's see, here you can see this is from the Penn Museum, University of Penn. You can see the deep hole here leading down to the water. You can see the aqueducts there. Here we can see it, a picture from above. Very impressive, right? Stairway going down to the bottom of the pool here. Here I'll share with you a newspaper article from 1957, September 29th. It's called from a newspaper called the Reading Eagle from the area of Pennsylvania. Look at the heading there. Famed biblical pool flows again after 2,500 years. Americans and Israelis carefully scraping the dry earth of Jordan. This was before the area came under, before the 6-Day War. Dry earth of Jordan within sound of gunfire from the troubled Israeli border have uncovered the Pool of Gevon, right? So this was a very dramatic find. So it was a quite certain identification of the location of Gevon. Like I said, situated pretty much smack in the middle of the mountain range north of Jerusalem. So these Gibeonites, they hear and they come towards Joshua, and let's see what they do. First of all, we have in the beginning of verse 4 the statement, and they also acted with wile, with cunning. Now the question is, what does that mean? And they also acted with wile, and as also in addition to whom? Who else acted with cunning and with wile? And here there are, I think, two possibilities in the Pshat reading, in the simple reading. One is that this would be a comparison to what the nations are doing. In other words, the nations are now acting cunningly and preparing a coalition to fight against the Israelites. And here they're also acting with cunning, but in a different route, and trying to accomplish a peace treaty, get a peace treaty out of the Israelites. So that might be they themselves also, in addition to the rest of the nations in Canaan. Another possibility is that maybe this is an attempt to draw a comparison with Joshua and his cunning when he attacked the Ai. We read about the conquest of the Ai and how we had an ambush, feigned trying to retreat, and then at a certain point after the city was burned, turn around and attack and conquer the Ai in the previous chapter 8. So maybe they're also acting in a cunning way, just like Joshua did. I think those are two viable options of the comparison. Are we comparing it to the opening verses of the chapter, or are we comparing it to the action described in the previous chapter 8? Fascinatingly, there's a really interesting midrash, a homiletical interpretation, not the simple reading, but the rabbis, the ancient sages, drew another comparison. And to understand their comparison, first of all, you need to know an additional piece of information. The people of Gibon, later on in chapter 7, you can see, are described as pertaining to the people called the Hivites, the Chivi, the Hivites. Why is this important? Well, we meet the people, the Chivi, the Hivites, early on in the Bible, in the book of Genesis. And there's a famous story, difficult story, in which the daughter of Jacob, Dinah, decides to go and get to know and travel in the land. And she's seen by the Hivite Shechem ben Hamor, who lives in the vicinity of Shechem in Samaria. And what happens there? We read that, and here you can see it. I hope you can see the story. Dinah, the daughter of Leah, right, who was born to Jacob, went out to look about amongst the daughters of the land, looking for friends. And Shechem, the son of Hamor, the Hivite, the prince of the land, saw her, and he took her, lay with her, and violated her. In other words, he rapes her, right? And she's being held. This is recounted in Genesis chapter 34. Now, Dinah is being held by this Shem, right? And then after she's raped, Hamor, the father of Shem, goes out in verse 6 to meet Jacob and to speak to him, right? And try to convince him to give Dinah as a wife to his son Shem, right? And they propose basically to become one people, right? And intermarry together, right? And then we read later on, verse 13. Thereupon Jacob's sons answered Shem and his father Hamor with cunning, with wile, and they spoke, because after all he had defiled their sister Dinah, and they said to him, we cannot do this thing to give our sister to a man who has a foreskin, for that is a disgrace to us. We can't marry somebody who's uncircumcised. So the proposition is that you have to circumcise, and then we'll agree to intermarry and leave our daughter with you. And that was accepted. The words pleased Hamor and Shem, but this was all a plot, right? So all the people of the city go ahead and circumcise themselves. Hamor and Shem speak. He's the leader of the town. Speak to all the people, and every people agree, and they say, listen, it's a good idea. We could circumcise and intermarry, and we'll get all their wealth, etc. Then shall not their cattle, their property, and all their beasts be ours, in verse 23. So they do that. And then we read in verse 25, now it came to pass on the third day, when they were in pain after circumcising themselves, that Jacob's two sons, Shimon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, each took his sword, and they came upon the city with confidence, and they slew every male. They destroyed the whole city. So this was basically a plot that was done cunningly, right, with ultimately tremendous violence, in order to save their sister Dinah, who was being held in the town of Shechem after she was raped. So they basically have a military operation, and instead of really accepting the peace initiative, they attack. And here we see the usage of peace as a weapon, right? Ultimately, use of deception and the entailing violence, right? So the rabbis connected between this story, and once again, let's remember that these people are considered Hivites, right? It's the same people, right? Look at that. And Shem, the son of Hamor, the Hivite, right? That's how the story is introduced. So the rabbis, how do they explain the description in this verse? And they also acted with wile, with cunning, right? They say, oh, this is also like the Israelites themselves, namely the sons of Jacob, Shimon and Levi, who acted with cunning, right, and pretended to want peace, but actually acted violently. So that's a third interesting midrash. I wouldn't say it's a simple reading, but it's more of a message that the rabbis wanted to say. If you deal cunningly, right, or in a dishonest way, eventually the dishonesty will meet up with you again. And that's exactly what the Hivites, the people of Gevon, do here. Use cunningness, pretending to come from a distant land, as we will read. So let's see the act of cunningness. To summarize, there were three possibilities raised, two according to simple reading, that they were acting cunningly like the rest of the nations who were acting cunningly in drawing a coalition to attack, or like Joshua, who acted cunningly in the previous war against the Ai. And according to the Midrash, the more homiletic interpretation meant to give ideas, this goes back to the story of Shimon and Levi in the city of Shechem. Okay, so let's see what cunningness the people of Gibeon have. So what did they do in the continuation of verse 4? And they went and disguised as ambassadors. I don't exactly know where they took that, but in the translation, I would say that disguised and they took, right? Worn sacks for their donkeys and wine bottles, I'd say, that are old, right? Here it's translated rotten, split, in other words, broken bottles, mended together and tied together. Not particularly fond of the translation of this verse, but basically what they're doing here is that they're taking a lot of worn out old utensils, right? Worn out sacks, broken bottles, right? Mended things that were torn and repatched, right? And what else in verse 5? And worn patched shoes, right? Sandals on their feet, and worn out garments upon them. And all the bread of their provisions was dry and moldy, right? So basically, they're taking a lot of old things, worn out things. Why do they do this? And they went to Joshua to the camp at Gilgal and said to him and to the men of Israel, notice already right off the bat, a double presentation of the leadership, Joshua and the men of Israel. We have come from a distant land and now make a covenant with us. So basically, they're putting on costumes, if you will. They're doing a Purim, right? Or if you will, a Halloween, depending on your background, right? They're dressing up as people coming from a distant land, and they invested a lot in their costumes, right? With worn out clothing, shoes, and materials. And they present themselves before the Israelite camp, before Joshua and all the men of Israel, and say, we have come from a distant land asking for a covenant, right? Brit, we want a covenant with you. Now, we would ask, what is the nature of and reason for this request? If you want to make a peace treaty, so just come straight forward and say you want to make a peace treaty. Why do you have to pretend that you come from a distant land? And here it is, I think, quite clear that the underlying assumption is that there's no possibility of having a peace treaty if you live within the land, if you're close to the land. And this we find pretty much explicitly stated, a prohibition of making a treaty with those who are in the land. For example, let's take a look at the book of Exodus, where we read, this is in Exodus chapter 34, from verse 11 and onwards. Keep carefully what I am commanding you today. Lo, I will drive out from before you the Amorites and the Canaanites, the Hittites and the Perizzites, the Hivites and the Jebusites. Beware lest you form a covenant with the inhabitants of the land into which you are coming, lest it become a snare in your midst. If you make a covenant, they're going to cause you trouble. But you shall demolish their altars, shatter their monuments, and cut down their sacred trees, etc. Right? So we have here in the book of Exodus an explicit prohibition of making a covenant. We read something quite similar, which we've already dealt with previously in the course, in Deuteronomy chapter 20, the laws of making war. So we know that in chapter 20, verse 10, we read, when you approach a city to wage war against it, you shall propose peace to it. And then if they agree, very well, they will serve you in verse 11. But if they don't, then you wage a war against them, right? And you will be victorious. And what do? And you shall strike all its males with the edge of the sword. So if they don't want to make peace, then they wage war, so you kill all the fighting soldiers. Verse 14, however, the woman, the children, and the livestock, and all that is in the city, all its spoils you shall take for yourself. And you shall eat the spoils of your enemies, which the Lord your God has given you. But you don't harm civilians, in other words, children, women, etc. Only those of fighting capacity. But look at nevertheless, the limitation on this. Thus you shall do to all the cities that are very far from you, which are not of the cities of these nations. However, of these people's cities, which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance, you shall not allow any soul to live. Rather, you shall utterly destroy them the Hittites and the Amorites, the Canaanites and the Perizzites, the Hivites and the Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you. Now, we already saw that there is a dramatic disagreement amongst Jewish commentators how to understand this section. It's clear that there's a distinction between those who are distant, very far from you, as it says in verse 15, and as opposed to the cities that are close by, that are in the land that is promised to you as an inheritance in 16. And the distinction is, do you kill everyone or only the fighting males? The big disagreement is, does the opening command to propose peace relate to all wars? That is how Maimonides and Nachmanides interpreted. Even in the war of the conquest of the land of Israel, there is the option of peace. And indeed, the ancient sages said that Joshua sent messengers with an offering of the possibility of a peace with the citizens of the land. However, Rashi, the famous Jewish commentator, disagreed. It was more from the north, from the area called Ashkenaz, which is northern France, southern Germany, as opposed to Maimonides and Nachmanides, who originated from Spain, eventually actually came to Israel. But Rashi says, no. The distinction is all across the board. In other words, you call for peace only to those that are close by. Sorry, call it peace, the opposite. You call it peace only to those who are distant. But those who are close by in the promised land, there's no possibility of peace. You're going to war and to destroy them. That's how Rashi interprets it. If we go back to our text, I believe that the text is a lot more in line with Rashi's interpretation, that there's no possibility of peace. And therefore, the alternative, what do the Gibeonites do? They apparently know what the Israelites were commanded, and therefore they understand their only solution is to pretend that they come from a distant land, and hence they could come under the category of those in which you can make a peace treaty with. So that's exactly what they try to accomplish here. How do the other commentators, Maimonides and Nachmanides, how do they grapple with this story? Well, some say, Joshua sent messengers earlier on to propose peace. And there's a one-time possibility of accepting peace. It was rejected. And now you lost, assuming you don't have the later possibility of accepting a peace treaty which was rejected. Too late, you vied for war, now face the war. That's one approach. Or they just say that the people of Gevon simply were mistaken. They could have had the option of peace. They didn't know that. But I feel that the more probable reading is in line with Rashi, that there wasn't an option of peace, and hence the Gibeonites are pretending to come from a distant land. Okay, so they come and they say they want a covenant, a two-sided covenant. Would seem to be an ideal proposal here. The Israelites always are looking for peace with their neighbors. Let's see how the Israelites will respond here. Verse 7. And each of the men of Israel said to the Hivites, perhaps you dwell in my midst, and how can I make a covenant with you? You may be not from a distant land, maybe you're from close by, and therefore we cannot make a covenant. And I think here it's quite explicit that there's no possibility of peace with the nations that live in Canaan. God commanded to destroy them, wanted to punish them, and give the land to the Israelites. So they're skeptical. The Israelites, the people here, are skeptical, and they say, this looks suspicious. What are you suddenly coming and asking for peace? Maybe you're close by, and we cannot make a covenant with you. They see, the Gibeonites, that things are not going too well with the people of Israel. So they move to Joshua in verse 8. We see this like double-natured leadership here. And they said to Joshua, we are your servants. Now notice, this is interesting. Not only have they approached somebody else, Joshua, the leader, but they have a different proposal. It's not now that they're asking for a covenant, they're actually proposing servitude. Right? It's not a covenant between two equals, right? But it's kind of a vassal agreement. We will be servants to you. Different language used here. Let's see how Joshua will respond. And Joshua said to them, "Who are you, and from where do you come?" Seems like Joshua himself is also suspicious, doesn't accept their presentation as coming from a distant land. Let's see their response in verse 9. And they said to him, "From a very distant land have your servants come." Notice the term servants. There's servile language. "Because of the name of the Lord your God, for we have heard of his fame and all that he did in Egypt and all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites that were on the other side of the Jordan, to Sihon, king of Heshbon, and to Og, king of Bashan, who was in Ashtaroth. And our elders and all the inhabitants of our country spoke to us, saying, 'Take provision in your hand for the journey and go towards them and say to them, we are your servants, and now make a covenant with us. This, our bread, we took hot,'" in other words, fresh, "for our provision, and out of our houses on the day we set out to go to you. But now behold, it is dry and has become moldy. And these wineskins which we filled were new, and behold, they are split. And these our garments and our shoes are worn because of the very long journey." So we see that the Gibeonites are indeed using wile and cunning and putting on a nice show, right? And trying to convince Joshua that they are indeed from a distant land. But in this dialogue, they add an additional component which we didn't find in the previous two. Not only do they say that they're from a distant land, but they give a motive. In other words, if you're from a distant land, why are you coming and asking for a covenant or to be our servants? It doesn't seem plausible. What's the motive? And what motive do they give? Here they use religious rhetoric, right? They say, "We have come." Why? "Because we heard of the greatness of your God. We have heard of his fame," right? And not only that, they even mention what they have heard. They elaborate. Now we know what they heard previously. The beginning of the chapter said they heard how Joshua conquered Jericho and the Ai. But now they present another narrative. What did they hear? They heard what God did in Egypt, right? They heard what God did to the kings on the east in the time of Moses, when Moses conquered, right, the two mighty nations to the east, Sihon and Og. That is what they heard. Now, there's something very sharp and cunning even in this religious rhetoric. It first gives them, right, a viable motive for why they're coming and proposing to be servants. But it's also a very sharp description which helps their cover story. They say that they come from a distant land, and note what they mention of having heard. Coming from a distant land, they heard what happened in Egypt and in Transjordan to the east in the time of Moses. What do they not mention as having heard? Well, they didn't hear about crossing of the Jordan. They didn't hear about the conquest of Jericho. They didn't hear about the conquest of the Ai, which we know they did, right? But why don't they mention? Obviously, this is part of their cover story, and we see how cunning they are, right? Because they're from a distant land, they don't know what's happening in this land. They just heard of what happened in other distant lands. And that shows part of their cunningness in their attempt to convince the Israelites of their story, that they indeed come from a distant land. And here their costume and show, right, their Purim spiel, right, seems to have worked, because we read in the following verse, verse 14. And the men took of their provision, right? I think simply they started analyzing, they saw that everything was indeed old, right? Some scholars think that this is part of the treaty where you take from what's offered for you as an offering, but I think simply they just analyzed, right, all their provisions and were convinced. Note what the verse says here in verse 14, and did not ask counsel of the mouth of the Lord. They didn't try to inquire what they should do. They didn't ask God, but they acted on their own volition and their own initiative, and they found the words to be convincing. Now, this statement, I think, is of great import in verse 14, because here we see the narrator maybe revealing some of his position on this story by not only describing what happened, but also describing what didn't happen and perhaps should have happened. They did not ask counsel of the mouth of the Lord. What they should have done is inquire and ask God what to do. And we read about this requirement in the book of Numbers. When Moses is told that he will not be entering the land, when Moses said, we need an alternative leader, appoint a man over the congregation, right, who will take over for me. And then God tells him, take, in verse 18, this is in the book of Numbers, chapter 27, and we're reading now in verse 18, the Lord said to Moses, take for yourself Joshua, the son of Nun, a man of spirit, and you shall lay your hand upon him. And in verse 19, and you shall present him before Eleazar, the Kohen, the chief high priest, and before the entire congregation, and you shall command him in their presence, etc. And then we are told, he shall stand before Eleazar the Kohen, that's Joshua, and seek counsel from him through the judgment of the Urim before the Lord, by his word, by the word of God. They shall go, right? And by his word they shall come, he and all Israel with him, and the entire congregation. Right? Joshua is instructed here that he should use the chief high priest, Eleazar, and the Urim, stones that seem to reveal, right, God's intention. This was this was the command that was given in the initial stage when Joshua was elected to be the replacing leader of Moses. And here, what are we informed? They did not ask counsel of the mouth of the Lord. We see here in verse 14. They apparently weren't convinced. And then we read in verse 15, and Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them live. And here there's also an additional important piece of information. Not only was peace made, but let's read the end of verse 15. And the princes of the congregation, this is a translation of Nisi'ei Haida, other leaders, in addition to Joshua, the princes of the congregation swore to them. They took an oath, right? That swore to them. It's the Shvuah, Vayishavu, right? They took an oath. In other words, not only is there a peace treaty, but it was under oath. In other words, it's a signed peace treaty with an oath, buttressed and backed up by their oath, the oath of the princes of the congregation, interestingly enough. This is the first section of our narrative, basically recounts how the people of Gibeon basically were allowed to remain amongst the Israelites, to live amongst the Israelites, were not obliterated when the Israelites conquered the land. Stage 2. Like I mentioned in the opening of the lecture, many modern scholars believe that originally there were two separate narratives. I don't think so. I think this is a united narrative, but it's definitely a second stage in the narrative. In verse 16 we read, and it was at the end of 3 days, after they had made a covenant with them, that they heard that they were their neighbors. and they dwelt among them. Uvekirbo hem yoshvim. Karov, they're amongst them. Suddenly the Israelites discovered, we don't know how, but they got the knowledge that those people of Gibeon are close by. They're not from a distant land at all. And let's see the response. Verse 17. And the children of Israel journeyed and came to their cities. There's, by the way, somewhat of an irony, right? Because we have the mention of hearing, right? Vayishmeu ki krovim, and they heard that they were their neighbors, or they were close by. Notice this whole narrative works upon what was heard. It opened up with all the other nations hearing what happened, and now the Gibeonites heard what happened, and then they respond. Now it's the Israelites' turn to hear what happened to them, right, and to respond. So they too journeyed, right, like the Gibeonites. The children of Israel journeyed and came to their cities on the third day. And their cities were Givon, which we already mentioned, and Kfira, and Be'erot, and Kiryat Yarim, right? Some of these names, those who are familiar with the modern geography of Israel know Kiryat Yarim is known. Kfira is a name of one of the valleys there. Be'erot is less certain. But this, we can say in general, is the area inhabited today by what is called Abu Ghosh, right? The road leading up, right, when you travel from the coastal plain, from Tel Aviv up to Jerusalem. So you pass by, when you're up in the mountains, the area of Abu Ghosh, right, on both sides of the highway. So this is where those Hivites come from, one of their major cities being Givon, right? An interesting additional side point of information. Fascinatingly, Abu Ghosh today in modern Israel is viewed differently, even though it's a non-Jewish town. It's inhabited by Arabs, but they're considered different Arabs, and they were actually not part of the War of Independence. They didn't fight against the Jews in the War of Independence in 1948, and were considered close and on peaceful terms with the Israelites. Even to this day, a lot of people stop by to eat hummus in Abu Ghosh, right? So it's fascinating that in ancient Israelite history, this area is a place that basically came in peace with the ancient Israelites, even in a deceptive way. And also in modern Israel, modern Israeli history, this area was different from the rest in that it was on more peaceful terms with the Israelites. Is it a coincidence, or perhaps the people of Abu Ghosh maybe are descendants of the original Gibeonites? Who knows? An interesting twist in history. So the Israelites approach the areas, their cities, the cities of the Hivites. Obviously, this is with some aggressive intention. But then we are informed in verse 18, and the children of Israel did not smite them, because the princes of the congregation, once again, the Se'aida, had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. So basically, the princes said, we can't attack them because we're under oath. We've made an oath that we won't. We'll keep them alive. And all the congregation complained against the princes. Vayilono, complained. It's a verb that we find throughout the whole narrative of the Israelites in the desert in the book of Numbers. But here we find it as well. This time they're complaining not about their conditions while traveling, but rather, what are they complaining about? That, hey, you sold us, you made a treaty with them, and apparently this angered the Israelites because they wanted to conquer this nice plot of land. Right now they cannot. All because what? Because the princes of Israel had sworn to them. And now the princes are under pressure in verse 19. And all the princes said to all the congregation, we have sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. Now therefore we may not touch them. They feel obliged by their oath. They signed a peace treaty, right? And they stand by their signature, by their oath. We see the tremendous, right, weight given to one's word, to one's oath. And this is not necessarily obligatory, because the whole treaty was done under a false pretense. One could have theoretically said, well, you fooled us, right? You lied, and therefore we're not obliged. And you might have expected that. You're no longer obliged to keep this treaty because it was under deception, false pretenses. And we may think that that's probably the logical position, but we see that that's not the case. Now, this could very well be because there was an oath taken in the name of God, right? And this is taken very heavily. An oath, right? The weightiness of taking an oath in the name of God is so great that even if you were deceived, you're obliged to keep your obligations, keep to your treaty with the Gibeonites, something which, unfortunately, many modern nations don't do and haven't done and aren't doing in the present time, keeping their previous obligations and commitments to other countries. So they can't attack them because there is an oath given to them. So what's the solution? And the princes said to them, let them live. So they became hewers of wood and drawers of water to all the congregation, as the princes had spoken to them. So the solution proposed by the princes is, we can't kill them, but what we can do is, we just promised we won't destroy them, but we will make them servants. They will be hewers of wood and drawers of water to all the congregation. Basically, I think they're trying to assuage the people who are very angry. Listen, now we can't conquer their land, right? We're going to lose part of our inheritance that God promised to us. So the princes say, okay, but what you do, you will gain at least servants that you'll be able to use, right? This is the proposal that the princes mention. Like I stated, there's like a dual leadership here. So we have the princes of the congregation. And in addition, in verse 22, once again, we have the mention of Joshua, just like in the first section. It was like a double leadership. We also find here, right, in the second section, after discovering the plot of the Gibeonites, right, once again, we also have a dual response. That's why I think this is a very unified narrative. So also here we read in verse 22, Joshua. And Joshua called for them. And he spoke to them, saying, why have you deceived us, saying we are very far from you, when you dwell among us? And now you are cursed, and there shall never fail to be slaves from you, and hewers of wood and drawers of water for the house of my God. So Joshua rebukes them with somewhat of a rhetorical question. Why did you deceive us? Well, it's very obvious why they deceived, because they want to stay alive. That's why apparently Joshua doesn't even wait for their answer, even though an answer will be coming, but he already states, right, their sentence, their punishment, that they will now be cursed, right, and will be slaves. But what's very interesting is, even though this seems to echo what the princes said, right, there's a small change here, because the princes said that they will be hewers of wood and drawers of water to all the congregation. Whereas Joshua states they will be hewers of wood and drawers of water for the house of God, not for the congregation, but rather for the house of God. Why this change? Well, I think here, first of all, the people were a lot angrier at the princes because they're the ones who made the oath. Maybe it's the oath that's preventing, right, the conquest of these people, of the Gibeonites. But I think also now Joshua understands that there is a problem. Why? Because we know what was the law, what was to be done in with regard to the anything that was taken, for example, from Jericho, all the wealth that was taken for Jericho. So it was destroyed. Everybody was destroyed. All the people were destroyed. You can't take people, right? The people were always destroyed. And if there's something you can't destroy, for example, metals, the gold, and as such, that was given to the house of God. In other words, there is a prohibition of making use of things which were supposed to be destroyed, and therefore the people were destroyed, and any wealth that was taken, for example, from Jericho, even the wealth was not allowed there, had to be given to the house of God. Now, what the princes proposed was problematic. Why? Because they say it's for the congregation. You're making use of something which is prohibited. It's part of the cherem. Let's remember, right, this great sin of Achan, which led to the loss in the first battle against the Ai. What was his sin? He took from the wealth, the booty of Jericho, and hid it in his tent, right? And we see the same language found with regard to taking wealth that's prohibited, and also with regard to the Gibeonites. With the Gibeonites, what was discovered is that they dwell among us. That's a translation is from the word bekirbeinu, right? Or bekirbi. We saw earlier on also the response of the Israelites who were skeptical and said, maybe you are amongst us, right? And there also we have the word bekirbi, right? Here we have in verse 7, bekirbi, maybe you are, right, in my midst, close to us, right? It's the same word. Now that terminology bekirbi, interestingly enough, echoes what we find in the description of the taking of the prohibited booty, right? In the aftermath in Joshua chapter 7, after they lose to the Ai, then God tells them, why did you lose? Cherem bekirbecha, verse 13. Bekirbecha, there is an accursed in your midst, right? This is the same language. This is prohibited. So what is Joshua's solution? Well, if it's prohibited, but now we can't destroy it, it's kind of parallel to what we had in Jericho, the metals that we couldn't destroy. We have to give it, we can't take it ourselves because it's prohibited. We give it to the house of God. And that's what Joshua exactly proposes here, in contrast to what the princes said, that they will be for the congregation. No, they will be for the house of God. Okay, let's see the response of the Gibeonites. And they answered Joshua and said, because, you asked us why? Because it was certainly told to your servants how the Lord your God commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land and to destroy all the inhabitants of the land from before you. And we were very afraid for our lives because of you and have done this thing. So now they tell the truth. We were scared for our lives because we knew that your God commanded Moses to destroy all the inhabitants. And now, behold, we are in your hand. As it seems good and right to you to do to us, do. So they say, now it's up to you. You treat us how you feel appropriate. Verse 26, and he did so to them, and he delivered them from the hand of the children of Israel, and they did not slay them. The Israelites want to attack them. They feel deceived, but Joshua here saves them. And Joshua made them that day hewers of wood and drawers of water for the congregation and for the altar of the Lord to this day in the place which he would choose. Right? So here we have an interesting summary and a combination of both. For the congregation and for the altar of the Lord. Could be perhaps in the beginning it was for the altar of the Lord, and then later on, as they joined the people, they became part of the congregation, right? And this is stated as something describing things that continue ad hayom hazeh, right, to this day. In other words, well after the events themselves occurred, the Gibeonites continued dwelling amongst the Israelites, and apparently also served when there was also in the altar of the Lord. And this is part of the idea proposed that this is also etiological. It's a story that's trying to explain the reality of these Gibeonites who were working at the altar and remained, even though they were foreigners, remained dwelling amongst the Israelites. The interesting question here is, okay, we understand how things occurred. We understand how the Gibeonites ended up remaining alive and actually becoming servants to the Israelites at the temple. But what is the attitude taken towards these Gibeonites? Are they worthy and supposed to have been saved, people who deserved remaining alive? Or are they simply cunning, liars, wicked people who took advantage and were able to fool the Israelites? What's the position of the narrator on the story? And this is what I find fascinating, because like I said, most of the book of Joshua is very clear and unequivocal. Everything's very clear. These are the sinners, they have to be destroyed. These are this person is positive, this person is negative. But how do we approach the Gibeonites? How do we relate to them in light of this narrative? So on the one hand, I think it is very clear that there is a critique of the Israelites. And like I said, this was found in verse 14, where the narrator explicitly stated that they didn't ask counsel of the mouth of the Lord. They didn't try to understand what they should do as far as what God would tell them. So this is they're acting on their own volition without inquiring God's position, and I think that we clearly see as a critique of the Israelites. But that doesn't necessarily tell us what was the position of the narrator in relation to the Gibeonites. It just says that the Israelites didn't behave appropriately in asking God instructions. But in the bottom line, the Gibeonites remain alive. And is this simply because of a failure of the Israelites, or perhaps they're deserving? And here I want to propose that the text actually wants to say that the Gibeonites deserve to remain alive. Where do I get that from? Well, I believe there is a clear analogy, comparison between the Gibeonites and another earlier character we met in the book of Joshua. And I'm referring to Rahab, another example of a non-Israelite who was saved. There are a lot of parallels between the story, particularly between chapter 2, verses, it's from verse 14, or even beforehand, chapter 2, verse 9 and onwards, and the story here of the Gibeonites. What are the parallels? In both instances, we read how Rahab presents the faith that God will give the land to the Israelites, and she describes how all the nations are very wary and frightened, and she recognizes the greatness of the God of Israel. And in both instances, the response is that basically there's an oath to save her, right? Let's take a look, go back to that chapter 2, right? What does Rahab say? And she said to the men, the spies who were sent, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that your terror has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land have melted away because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the waters of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites that were on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you completely destroyed. And as soon as we heard, our hearts melted, nor did there remain any more spirit in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and on earth below. And now, so here we have a profession of faith on the part of Rahab. And now I pray, swear to me by the Lord, since I have showed you kindness, she harbored the spies, that you will also show kindness to my father's house and give me a true token. And you shall preserve alive my father and my mother and my brothers and my sister and all that they have, and you shall deliver our lives from death. And the men answered her, our life for yours, if you will not tell this, our discussion. They take an oath that they won't harm her. So basically, a lot of the things that Rahab said, we hear echoed again in the words of the Gibeonites. And I feel there's an analogy between them. And ultimately, the outcome is similar. In both instances, there's an oath given to them, and it's an oath to promise to save them, their extended family. By the way, in both instances at the end, we're told, indeed, after the Israelites conquer Jericho, that Rahab dwelt amongst the Israelites. To this day, is a long-term reality, right? So I believe this analogy is meant to inform us of the position of the narrator. The Gibeonites indeed used trickery, and the Israelites failed in not asking God. But ultimately, the bottom line result seems to be desirable. Namely, the Gibeonites were indeed worthy of being saved because they were people who recognized, right, the God of Israel, recognized his greatness, understood that the land belongs to Israel and was given to them by God. And therefore, they are deserving of being saved and also dwelling amongst the Israelites. And hence we see a second example of certain exceptions to the rule of having to destroy the residents of the land. Rahab was saved, and now the Gibeonites. Rahab was saved because the Israelites came to her, right, and ended up being in her house, the spies. And she saved them, so in return, she was saved. The Gibeonites, on the other hand, actually initiated and went to the Israelites, opposite direction, but were able to get what they were looking for, to get a peace treaty, and as such, save their lives and continue dwelling amongst the Israelites. So we have here a story of a peace treaty in the midst of the conquests of the land of Israel. Usually a peace is something which is described in idyllic language. This is a more intricate peace, a peace that was used as a weapon against the Israelites. But ultimately, it seems like the narrator is in accord with the bottom line result that the Gibeonites indeed deserved to remain and live in peace as they wished with the Israelites and also serving in the temple. And this was an oath that was given. Later on in the Bible, we see that this oath wasn't kept throughout all of history because King Saul, the first king of Israel, actually waged war and attacked the Gibeonites. And we are informed later on in towards the end of the book of Samuel that this was viewed as a severe sin, not upholding the covenant with the Gibeonites. And indeed, there's a punishment, there's a famine, and God informs King David that the reason for the famine is because of what Saul did to the Gibeonites. And then the only way to repair this is to punish the descendants of Saul. This is the story that we read later on towards the end of the book of Samuel. And also even in the Second Temple period, there are a group of non-Jews, right, who are found in the temple and are called the Nitinim, right? And these Nitinim, according to some commentators, may relate to the Gibeonites because they are Nitunim. They were given to the house of the Lord. And it could be that they continued even into the Second Temple period. So this is the fascinating story of the history of the Gibeonites, which all begins with the treaty that was made between Joshua and the princes of Israel and the Gibeonite people. And this goes back even earlier on into the history of the meeting of the Hivites in the time of Jacob with Dinah. So and stretches into modern history, interestingly enough, in the same, at least geographical location, the Abu Ghosh. Fascinating history of interaction between some of the residents of the land, where there were close ties, even though sometimes with friction between the Israelites and the dwellers in that area of Gevon, Abu Ghosh.